Welcome to episode 10 of I Thought I Knew How, a podcast about knitting and life and all sorts. I'm your host, Anne Frost, and this episode was recorded on June 14th, 2019. Today I'd like to talk to you about a couple of other podcasts related to the Master Hand Knitter Program, When Stashes Go Awry, Worldwide Knit in Public Day, Harriet's Hat, and a few more things. There's a lot to talk about today, so let's get started. Let's quickly give away our giveaway from last episode. This giveaway was for a selection of items from the Massachusetts Sheep and Woolcraft Festival, including a hand-sewn anti-moth sachet, some dyed locks for spinning or needle felting, some felted acorns, a taster hank from Tidal Yarns, and some stitch markers. We had almost 500 entries this time, and the winner was Roxy, also known as On the Move 222, who won with an entry she got by sharing the episode post in her story. So thank you for that, Roxy. Thank you to everyone who participated and spread the word about the giveaway and the last episode. Roxy, you should have already heard from me, but if you haven't, check your Instagram direct messages or send me a note with your mailing address, and I'll get this sent out to you. Keep listening for the giveaway for this episode coming later in the show. Here is when I'm meant to be talking about how things are going with the Master Knitter Program. I did absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. Sometimes that just happens. I have the seed stitched down. I just need to find a couple hours when I can sit down and knit the swatch all at once so my tension doesn't change between knitting sessions. And I could not make that happen between the last episode and this one. I do not know where the last 2 weeks went. I almost didn't even do an episode this week because it does not seem like enough time has passed, but I happened to notice it on the calendar in time to get my stuff together. So instead of updating you on my progress, I want to instead draw your attention to a few other podcasts. You all know I love podcasts. I wouldn't have started this one if I didn't. And I talked in the last episode about how I've recently been getting caught up on all the recent knitting history that I missed out on by listening to old podcasts. I have 2 podcasts that I'd like to draw your attention to that relate to the Master Knitting Program. The first one is called Mastering the Knits. Now, when I came up for this idea for this podcast about going through the Master Knitting Program, I went to iTunes and Google and I searched around and I could not find another knitting podcast that was specifically dedicated to the program. So I thought, yes, okay, perfect. Let's fill that niche. And I got everything up and running, launched an episode, got my social media up and running. And one of the first people to follow my Instagram account was Natalie, the host of Mastering the Knits. I mean, what could I do? I'd already started. I had websites all set up. I resolved not to listen to her podcast for the first few months so that I was sure not to inadvertently copy what she was doing with her show and to develop my own style with this show. So that's what I did. But she's a really lovely person to follow on Instagram. She has a very kind spirit. And finally, I subscribed to her podcast and started listening. She obviously is also going through the Master Hand Knitter Program. Her podcast started with a co-host, but now it's just her. And she has interviews and talks about her progress. And she has actually finished level 1. And the last I knew, she was working on fixing a few things to resubmit. But I am glad I held off on listening right away. And I'm glad that I missed that her podcast existed when I was starting mine, because I think that we serve as 2 separate voices with our own style and our own experience with the program and our own way of talking about it. Her podcast is great. I'm enjoying it as someone going through the program because she went through some of the same issues that I'm experiencing right now, mainly finding the time to actually do the program. If you are listening to this podcast because you're interested in or doing the program yourself, be sure to listen to Mastering the Knits as well. Second, I've been trying to go through the old knitting podcast chronologically, and I'd made it to 2009 when I realized I'd missed a couple of podcasts that had started before that point. So I went back to something like 2006 with those podcasts, and I've been working on listening forward to 2009 again. But one of those podcasts I didn't actually miss. I had skipped it on purpose. It's the Nitpicks podcast, and I'd skipped it for a couple of reasons, and I won't get into all of those reasons, but I will say that the main reason was that I thought it was basically just going to be a commercial for their yarns, and that really didn't appeal to me. But after talking in the last episode about the role that these old podcasts play in preserving knitting history, and seeing that I'd missed a few other podcasts in that 2006 to 2009 period anyway, I figured I'd go ahead and at least listen to a few episodes of the Knit Picks podcast. And if it was just a constant commercial for their yarns, I would give myself permission to unsubscribe. Well, of all the podcasts that I'd missed in that 3-year time period, the Knit Picks podcast turned out to be the most evergreen of them. It's hosted by Kelly Pitkin, one of the owners of Knit Picks. And yes, she does talk about knitting projects using the Knit Pick yarns, but the focus of the podcast is on knitting techniques and interviews with designers. I'm halfway through episode 19, so I can't vouch for all 300 episodes, but these early ones cover topics that are still relevant today and have included bits of information here and there that have been majorly helpful for me. For instance, in an interview with Shannon Oakey, Shannon shared that when she teaches people to knit, she teaches them to do the cable cast on rather than the long tail cast on. In the cable cast on, everything is the same as working a knit stitch, except you move the new stitch back onto the needle. And of course, when it's then time to knit, they already know how to make the knit stitch. They just have to keep it on the needle instead of moving it back onto the cast on needle. As someone who just went through the agony of trying to teach a dozen preteen girls how to knit, the genius of that hit me like a 2x4. Almost every episode has contained an aha moment like that for me. But the clincher that really made me want to call your attention to this podcast was when I was listening to Kelly interview Ann Budd about knitting socks. Now, you all know that I have yet to knit socks, but I listened anyway because, like I said, almost every episode had an aha moment for me. At one point in the interview, they shifted from talking about knitting socks to Anne having finished the Master Knitter program. Well, that perked up my ears, and Kelly asked Anne rather excitedly if she would recommend the program to others. And there was a pause and a hesitancy in her answer that made it clear that no, she wouldn't particularly recommend the program to others. And that really made me listen. And what followed was a very honest, frank assessment of why the Master Knitter program exists, why it would be beneficial to some people, and why most people probably shouldn't bother. And I will not tell you any more than that. I will leave it to you to go give that episode a listen. I'll help you out by putting a direct link to that episode in the show notes. It was a good interview all around, and it's worth listening to. So rather than reporting my progress, because I have made none, I thought I'd draw your attention to a couple more voices who have experience with the program, because I know there are quite a few of you who listen to this podcast because you're toying with the idea of doing the program as well. I am so very excited to share the songs from today's episode with you. My brother told me about this artist after he saw him in concert. The Suitcase Junket is Matt Lorenz and his truly impressive setup that allows him to create his unique sound as a one-man band. Now, I know what you're thinking when I say one-man band. Trust me, it is not what you're used to. His music is amazing. Everything you'll hear in this first song is produced by Matt as he's singing the song. I really recommend you check out his stuff. His YouTube channel is full of videos of his performances, and they are amazing. This first song I'm going to share is called So No from his album Make Time.
So
have something that's been rolling around in my mind over the last couple of months, and I almost brought it up in the last podcast, but I hadn't fully shaped my thoughts about it, and I don't know if I have them all settled now, but sometimes talking is what gets things to click into place. Before I launch into these thoughts, I want to make it clear that they are thoughts coming from my own experience. Most of them are very personal, and they are being offered as something to chew on. Warning, maybe? Anti-inspiration? Whether you decide to swallow my words or spit them back out is up to you. I want to talk about stash. And now that you know that, I want to back up and share a few things about my history of my relationship with my mother's stash. I was raised by a woman who had a lot of truly wonderful characteristics, but she also was a hoarder. And she hated when I pointed that out to her because in her mind, hoarders were people who lived in absolute squalor, who had paths through their homes to get to the few areas they could still use, and they smelled like cat pee. That was not my mother, but my mother did hoard two things. She hoarded food and craft supplies, mostly yarn. If you'd come into our home when I was a kid, I think the impression you'd get was that it was a little untidy. But in certain rooms and behind the closed doors of the kitchen cabinets, the refrigerator, there was food tucked away everywhere, and there was yarn and plastic canvas projects literally everywhere. I would estimate that about 25% of the space in the house was given over to storing these things, and it was not a big house. In my mother's mind, she was storing food against emergencies, and she would eventually get to the project she'd bought all that yarn for. But a lot of that food was expired, and it would have taken a team of knitters many years to use up all the yarn. To give you an idea of just how much yarn we're talking about, at one point she decided to consolidate it all into one room in the basement. Only she ran out of steam partway through getting it organized and didn't get it all properly stored in that room, which is a room that would flood in the spring when the snow melted. So a lot of the yarn hadn't made its way into containers and was ruined. I decided to take some time and get it all cleaned up for her. I threw away 5 large trash bags of destroyed yarn, and I went through the Rubbermaid containers that were left and sorted them so that all the unfinished projects were in bins together, and yarns that were kits went into their own containers, and unassigned yarns were in their containers. And as I went through, I pulled out 2 more trash bags of yarn to be donated to the senior center and a couple other bags to go to a local knitting group. Plus, I filled a suitcase for myself. And when I had finished, there were still 22 Rubbermaid bins of yarn remaining. 22. I don't think I bought yarn myself until I was well into my 20s. And even then it was rare because I'd just go down and grab what I needed from my mother's stash. She'd let friends come by and go through and take what they needed too. But eventually she moved into a smaller apartment and sold the house to my brother. She took 9 bins of yarn with her. The 9 bins were stacked in 3 stacks of 3 in the second bedroom of her new apartment, and she bought some industrial shelves to store all the food she needed in case of emergency. And of course, at first it was neat, but over time she'd come home with a bag of yarn that she didn't have time to sort into a bin, or a bag full of pasta that had been on sale 3 for $1 and she didn't have room to put it on the shelves, so she'd leave it sitting on the floor. And eventually she just started sort of hucking the bags in the general direction of the yarn or the food because she couldn't get in to put them away properly. And then she couldn't get to the things she'd bought at all, so when she needed something, she'd go buy it new. In the smaller living space, the things did start looking like you'd traditionally think of as a hoarder home. But before things got truly out of control, she moved again. This time to an even smaller living situation. The stash was downsized once again, but again, it wasn't by much, and the buying continued, and soon things started to get out of control again. Sadly, the people who ran that house had mismanaged their funds, and the house had to be closed down. She eventually ended up in a nursing home with 1 container of yarn, but that did not stop her. She would have friends come by and take her on trips to the yarn store or the craft store and then swing by the grocery store on the way home. I lived overseas at this time, and on our visits home, I would have nurses take me aside and ask me to help her get it under control because it was affecting her health. And the yarn bursting out of her drawers and the closet was making it hard for them to work, and her roommate was having a hard time maneuvering around. So I'd go in and get it all organized again and sneak some of it away, but by the next visit, it would be chaos again. Now, my mother is an extreme case, but she's not alone in her extremity. It would have been one thing if she could afford it, but she really couldn't. She lived on the edge of poverty. She never made the connection between her hoarding and her poverty either. Yarn or food bought on sale was money saved, and buying a little something cheered her up. When I moved out on my own, I took a lot of her habits with me. I bought food ahead of when I'd need it because it was on sale. I bought yarn I liked because it was on sale, even though I didn't have a project in mind, and I had plenty of yarn I'd already pilfered from her stash. And then I got married, and suddenly my decisions affected someone else. When I first got married, we both worked full-time and life was good. We had 2 full paychecks. Then when I was pregnant, I left teaching to stay home with the kids. And at that time, I had been earning more than my husband, who was still in college. So we took quite a hit to our income. He took on more hours and we made enough to get by, but not enough to buy without consideration anymore. I knit more from my stash and it began to dwindle, but not by much. Ravelry was new and people were eager to clear out their own stashes, so the forums were full of people selling amazing yarns at unbelievable prices. I still had yarn coming in, just not as fast as it had been before. When it came time for us to move to the Philippines, I filled one large moving box with yarn to take along and sold the rest of my stash on Ravelry. I started by selling off the things I had in larger quantities and the nicer yarns, and then towards the end, I'd fill a flat rate shipping box with random skeins and sell them for $15 each. It was hard at first. I had associated these yarns with major successes. 3 balls of 100% cashmere, all for $20. Victory. Enough lace weight silk for 2 shawls for $15. Amazing. Send it to me. There were dopamine hits galore tied up in my stash, and now I was getting rid of almost all of them. And it was hard. But when we got to the Philippines and I opened my yarn box, it felt different. I pulled out hank after skein of yarn that I was truly looking forward to using and not just owning. It felt freeing. It was hard to find yarn in the Philippines. There was one true yarn store I knew about, but it was up in the city and it was hard to get to. I think I only walked into it maybe 3 times the whole time I lived there, and I never actually bought any yarn from them, just some notions. I discovered at one point that it was really easy and inexpensive to order bamboo yarn from China and have it shipped, but then I'd have to go pick it up in person at the post office to deal with customs, and that got old really quick. But when I went home to visit, not only did I have access to yarn stores again, I would also arrive to find my mother's stash out of control. All the anxiety and worry about her and her spending would come back, and I'd organize it all again for her and take more away with me as a way to try and save her from the clutter. And it never worked. Her habits were her own, and taking the yarn with me just meant that I had more yarn I had to deal with, and it cleared up more space for her to fill. Because I had so much of her yarn coming back to the Philippines with me, when it came time to pack up and move back to the US, despite all the Christmas gifts I'd knit and the baby blankets and household items and sweaters, I came back with 2 boxes of yarn. 3/4 of one box was full of yarn I'd actually moved there with almost 9 years before. When my mother died, she had 1 bin of yarn and enough knit socks for everyone in the family to get a pair. I handed out the socks in the weeks after she died, along with the other items that had belonged to her that I knew would have meaning to the people who received them. And I had promised her that I would use her yarn to knit everyone in the family a Christmas gift from her. And I did. I handed out hats and cowls to everyone at our Christmas party last year. And I don't know what was in the mind of my brothers or my nieces and nephews, but for me, there were really complicated feelings attached to those projects. My mother knit for all of us in her lifetime. She did it to show us she loved us. But it was also a hobby that consumed her, that complicated her finances, and in that way caused her a lot of stress that transferred to her relationships with us. We could see how her innocuous grandmotherly hobby of knitting for herself and for family was a monster on her shoulder, complicating her life, but she could not. And she was so sensitive to any suggestion that her yarn stash was in any way responsible for her financial problems. Recently, I was asked to take part in a 3-month-long personal finance course through my church. I had one of the organizations at the church, and all of us who lead groups were asked to take the class so we know what it was like and could intelligently recommend it to others who might benefit from it. A lot of this stuff in the class I had already figured out through the School of Hard Knocks, but I did have a few aha moments. The main message of the class really was to be self-aware and personally responsible. Everything from the early classes on drawing up a budget to the final few classes on retirement really was rooted on not kidding yourself about your financial situation and making responsible decisions. As I sat in that class, it brought up a lot of the feelings I had toward my mother and her stash. And really, when it comes down to it, I see the stash as a manifestation of some depression she was not dealing with properly. So I do try not to judge her too harshly, but even though there was a cause and it was a pitiable cause, that doesn't mean that it didn't affect a lot of us in some pretty negative ways and that we still carry the feelings and are having to work our way through them. So why am I sharing all of this with you? I mean, of all the things I have shared with you so far in this podcast, the situation with my mother's stash, is the one that is the hardest for me to talk about. So why am I sharing it at all? Well, a few days ago on Instagram, an image was circulating of an online yarn store that has an option that you can select when you check out that says something to the effect of, if you need an alibi for this yarn, check here and we will include a message to congratulate you for winning a giveaway. And I hope that this was just an attempt to be funny with their customers. And I don't know who the yarn store is. I purposely did not go back and find the image because I don't want to call anyone out. I hope that the company was just trying to be funny. But the reality is that humans get obsessive, especially with their hobbies. And my heart sank when I saw this because I thought of the families out there, like the family I grew up in, who are being negatively affected by someone in the family who has a yarn obsession, who feels compelled to buy the yarn, but also knows that the rest of the family is so frustrated that the purchase needs to be cloaked as a giveaway. I think about the spouse who loves the knitter but is struggling with patience and bills. I think about the kids who feel the financial stress sometimes even more than the parents because they don't have a full view of the world yet and they're grappling with the idea of adults having imperfections. And I think about the knitter who maybe just wants a bit of luxury after having had to pinch pennies for so long, or who has some stuff to deal with and is looking for a dopamine hit instead of dealing with it. I wanted to laugh. I wish I could be one of the people who saw it and thought, oh, what's the big deal? Get a sense of humor. But I couldn't because I knew that there are people out there who will be checking that box because they need to. And I was thinking about the people who love them. Your family is made up of the people who depend on you the most. And sometimes that means that you have to delay gratification so that you can pay a bill or eliminate some tension. Part of what I do as a podcaster is tell you about yarns I like. I'm about to do that again in a few minutes. People give me yarn, so I will talk about it. I'm basically an advertiser. But I would also like to make it clear that when I talk about the yarn I like, I'm doing so not so you will go out and buy it blindly. I do it so you're informed and you make the right yarn purchase for the right project, and you make things that are beautiful and will be loved and used, your family should associate your knitting with kindness, not chaos. I don't ever want you to feel like you should buy yarn just because I said the yarn is nice. I was headed down the same stash hoardy path as my mother, but I was lucky enough to have my life path take me in some directions that gave me time and experiences and support to think about what the decision to buy more yarn means in the larger scheme of things. It's not always about the yarn. Sometimes it's about feeling better. And if you're buying something to make yourself feel better, instead face what is making you not feel great and fix it. If it's because you're tired, sleep on the decision. I can't think of a single yarn maker I know who would want you to buy their yarn if it meant that it was going to add tension to your personal relationships. In Rubbermaid bin terms, that's a unit of measurement these days, right? Anyway, I think in Rubbermaid bin terms, I have about 3 bins of yarn. It's not actually stored in bins, which is why I don't know exactly, but that really feels to me like the upper end of sanity for me. I like having a stash. I like to be able to have some yarn on hand for a project that crops up and looks wonderful, and I'd like to start on it right away. But I would like my stash to be less. I would like it to fit comfortably in the steamer trunk in my office. To me, that feels reasonable. I feel like at that level of stash, I will have yarns that I picked out myself, that are mostly destined for projects that I fully intend to knit, maybe with a few souvenir skeins from traveling or going to an event. After so many years of drawing yarns away from my mother's stash in an attempt to help her get things under control, I'd really like to feel like I had control over my own stash. Maybe unsurprisingly, the reason why I'm not there yet has to do with yarn that came to me from my mother's stash. There's not a lot left of it, but I still feel that complicated loyalty to my mother and her obsession and feel like I need to use it up for her. A few more baby projects and I think it will all be gone. I will still have some things that she made for me to remember her and her knitting by, but I will not be sad when the unused yarn is gone. We live in a treat yourself culture here in the US, but treating yourself can have an effect on others. I'm not saying you should never buy yarn. I'm not even saying that my ideal stash size is the ideal stash size for everyone. What I would like to suggest, though, is that if you feel the need to hide your yarn purchases from your spouse, or if you have bills that are going unpaid because you're buying yarn, you can fix this. I'll have a link in the show notes to some resources. I'm about to talk about this more later in the podcast, but this is the promotion slot, so I'm going to talk about it here too. My knitter friends, don't forget about Harriet's hat. The pattern is £4. You can now pay for it with PayPal, and the proceeds go directly toward helping Shetland get an MRI scanner so that the sick and injured do not have to travel to the Scottish mainland to get this test. If you need to buy the yarn, you can get it as a kit from thewoollythistle.com. You'll save 10%, and Colleen Clare is donating the profit from the kits to the cause as well. You should absolutely stash dive first, though. This is a great project for partial skeins, and a lot of the photos of the hat knit from stash have been really gorgeous. It's a great cause, and you've heard me talk about it a lot by now. If you have felt the pull to help out and it keeps slipping your mind, here's your reminder. I'll have all the pertinent links in the show notes, or just Google Harriet's hat and you'll find the sites you need that way. Did you do anything for Worldwide Knit in Public Day? I had an embarrassment of riches to choose from for events. There was one at a yarn store near me that I haven't been to yet, but I decided not to go there for Worldwide Knit in Public Day because I'll be visiting it as part of the I-91 yarn shop hop in a couple of weeks, and I figured I'd see it then. There was another one about 30 minutes south of me in a library, and another one 30 minutes north of me that was going to take place on the village common of a very pretty little town. So the pretty little town won out. And I drove up to Longmeadow, Massachusetts on June 8th with my camp chair in the trunk and the stuff I needed to cast on for Harriet's hat. The group had set up under a large tree on the commons and welcomed me right away. I sat between Sonia and Lynn. Longmeadow has 3 different knitting groups, one at the library, senior center, and another at a church that makes prayer shawls and christening blankets. The timing for the one at the library actually works really well for me, but they don't meet in the summer, so I'll have to wait until Labor Day to check it out. There were a group of ladies who came from a knitting group at the main library in Springfield, Massachusetts, too, and a mother with 2 daughters who came all the way from the Boston area. Everyone spent 3 hours out in the lovely weather in the shade of a giant tree, chatting and eating and winning prizes provided by Knitting Creations and Webs and the local knitting groups. It was really nice to get together with some fellow fiber nerds and have a chat. I think there were maybe 40 people altogether, and we had a few cars slow down to see what was going on. As I said, I cast on for Harriet's hat while I was there because it was also the start of the worldwide knit-along for Harriet's hat that's being hosted by the Minnesota Knitters Guild. It's too late now to qualify for a cast-on prize, but the knit-along is going on until July 20th, so you still have time to take part and maybe win a prize for finishing. You can find the information on the Ravelry group for the Minnesota Knitters Guild. Before I left to go to the Knit in Public event, I knew I was going to be casting on for the Fair Isle hat, so I watched about an hour of Fair Isle videos on YouTube, and I finally saw one that clicked for me regarding my tension problem. I could not get my floats to be long enough to prevent puckering. The lady who was demonstrating in the video talked about keeping the knitting on the right hand needle slid down as far as it will comfortably go before switching to the next color. You don't force it down the needle. You just position it as far down as it will go and stay on its own. Then when you work the stitch in the new color, the float will be long enough and you won't get puckering. If you force the finished fabric too far down the needle, your floats will be too loose. For some reason, this finally clicked for me. I have been keeping this advice in mind as I go, and so far it has worked brilliantly. Unfortunately, last night I had to rip out about a dozen rows of the hat. I was really loving it too. I'd misread the instructions on the increase row, and I had increased every 8 stitches instead of increasing 8 stitches total. So I ended up with 8 extra stitches on my needles, and I didn't notice because the chart after the increase row was an 8-stitch repeat. So it completely hid my mistake. It wasn't until I got to the second row of the next chart that I realized something was wrong. I thought maybe I could fudge that chart by altering the pattern a little, but I realized I was in over my head at that point and it wasn't going to work out. So I just pulled it off the needles. It was like 12:30 at night at that point, and I frogged back to the end of the ribbing and I started the hat again from there. I'm not terribly torn up about it, though. I really enjoyed knitting that bit of the hat, so I'm sure I'll enjoy knitting it again. And really, I've been pleasantly surprised by the Jamieson and Smith yarn I've been using. I kept hearing that Shetland yarn is so soft and wonderful, to the point that early in the Industrial Revolution, the mechanical spinning machines couldn't handle 100% Shetland wool, and it had to be processed as a blend with poorer quality yarns. And I say this, but on a Shetland fleece, you have many different grades of fiber. They haven't been bred to have uniform fleeces like many of the more modern breeds, so you get the softest yarn from around the neck, and other areas of the body have varying quality. But still, when I first held a ball of Shetland yarn in my hand, I wasn't really impressed. In the ball, the yarn feels crunchy. Not itchy so much as it has a definite texture to it and a bit of a crackle. As I knit it up though, the fabric is sleek, and the more it's handled, the softer it's getting. I am really looking forward to finishing this and getting it blocked, because if the rumors are true, that's when it really blossoms. I will keep you posted. It's time for another song from the Suitcase Junket. This song is from his newest album, Mean Dog Trampoline. You'll hear that he's added some outside help on this album, but it's still mostly him at his one-man band kit. He's added to his arrangement as time has progressed, and the depth of the music he's able to produce has gotten to be truly astounding. This is Everything I Like.
yeah. And the neon lights, well, they flicker for a minute. And it both start living in the sound. Well, that jukebox superhero brings on the street. Everything I like. Everything I like. Everything I like happens at night. Happens at night. Yeah, it happens at night. Yeah, it happens at night. It happens at night. Now everybody's talking about some new sound funny, but it's still rock and roll to me. And I spent all my money on that brand new pair of speakers, so I stole that old Billy Joel CD. All the time shows were sitting into the night, and the dawn on the horizon never feels quite right. But once the sun sinks in again, and all the world is dark and dim, and everybody's dressed up for the weekend. Oh, and the radio hits your favorite song. The 3.5 minutes never felt so long, and it makes you feel like thinking strong for singing. Yeah, 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 yeah. Everything I like. Everything I like. Everything I like happens at night. Yeah, it happens at night. Yeah, it happens at night. Yeah, everything I like, it happens at night. Everything
If you've enjoyed these songs and live in the area, the Suitcase Junket will be performing at the Green River Festival at Greenfield Community College. The event runs from July 12th to the 14th, and the Suitcase Junket will perform on this Saturday. I will be there. You can get tickets through the link in the show notes or Google for the Green River Festival. One last thing before I go, and quickly, because this episode is getting long in the tooth. This week's giveaway is from me. I was at Webb's the other day and they had some yarn that I thought looked delightfully summery and thought I am going to make that a giveaway. It's 3 balls of Bristol Yarn Gallery's summer set in a sunshiny yellow. It's 85% Pima cotton and 15% silk. To enter, find the post for this episode on either Ravelry or Instagram and tell me what you're looking forward to most this summer. You have to have a U.S. mailing address and be over 13 to enter. I'll ask Siri to pick a number after June 28th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time and announce the winner on episode 11. Now note, normally in past giveaways, as long as you're a member of the Ravelry group or following me on Instagram, you are automatically entered. That's not happening on this giveaway. You have to comment on the Instagram post or the Ravelry thread to enter. In the meantime, thank you for listening and knitting with me for a bit. If you would like to contact me, email me at ann@familypodcasts.com. That's Ann with an E at familypodcasts.com. I'm on Ravelry, Instagram, Pinterest, and YouTube as I thought I knew how. If it's a place that allows you to put spaces between the words, then there are spaces between the words. Otherwise, it's all one word. The Facebook and Ravelry groups are both called I Thought I Knew How Podcast, and I'm on Twitter as @ThoughtIKnewHow. The website for the show is ithoughtIKnewHow.familypodcasts.com. There you will find the show notes for each episode. Every now and then I post a blog post there too. Please consider joining the Knit Along for Harriet's Hat to help raise money for the Shetland MRI scanner appeal. There will, of course, be a link in the show notes for that. If you are a musician like the Suitcase Junket or know one and would like to have a song featured on the program, drop me an email and point me to where I can hear your music. You need to be the copyright holder to be able to grant permission, so keep that in mind. Until next time, may you be blessed with stitches that never drop, yarn without joins, and plenty of time to knit.